Greetings all, good afternoon. My name is F.A. Osarin. Welcome to our last presentation, Reproductive Futurism. I'm going to be presenting about my experience with becoming a midwife. At first, I was a little nervous about this presentation because it can be quote unquote controversial, right? And basically controversial means anything that is uprooting white supremacy in general. And particularly, my qualms are what I would like to really see shift in the discussion of maternal mortality, infant mortality, and just the maternal outcomes, and the US not being very well or being very poor, is to also address what's going on in-house of providers. And so this presentation, Liberating United States Midwifery, Divestment from Harm. We get right into it. My large goal for this presentation and in general would be one licensure for all. So as of right now in the United States, there's licensed midwife, there's certified professional midwife, there's certified nurse midwife, and there is a certified midwife. And then there's practitioners who are present, sort of like an OBGYN or a nurse practitioner. And then you have unlicensed midwives in territories or states that do not make them legal or do not make them illegal. They just don't really have any policy support. And as you can see, that sounds very confusing, considering if you wanted to midwife, you have to really consider what part of the state you're in and what that looks like. Also, what I've been running into is someone who does want to work internationally, who does want to travel and be able to take my work with me like doctors do or nurses do, is because of the alphabet soup of of midwifery pathways. It is difficult to kind of choose which one is best for you, and as well as not all of them are recognized once you leave the United States or Canada, and sometimes not even including Canada. So these midwifery organizations, there are several of them. Most of them, or at least the beginning, started with North American Registry of Midwives, NARM is what we call them for short, which is a national certification process of the CPMs, and it was developed and managed by NARM. And so basically it was a group of white women who decided to create licensure for themselves, started in 1992. As of today, in 2021, they have an entire all-white board, members who have been part of the board for possibly since the inception of NARM. NARM is where if you want to be a CPM, whether you are going to an accredited meek school or you're doing this through the PEP route, you have to go through NARM. And as some of you may know or may not know, it is very outdated in terms of paperwork and getting signatures and very confusing paperwork. There's an entire Facebook page dedicated just to how to fill out the paperwork and make sure you do it correctly to prevent being audited and so forth. Even being audited is on a bias, notion. They decide what goes through and what not goes through. Then there is MANA, the Midwives Alliance of North America. Their mission is to unite, strengthen, support, and advocate for the midwifery community and to promote educational, economic, and cultural sustainability of the midwifery profession. And all these words sounds really great, right? It's, this really beautiful ideal of what they're supposed to be, but what they are is completely different. Like NARM, MANA has a predominantly white board. If I remember correctly, they have an interim president right now who is a Black person and may have a brown midwife on there too, but majority it is white ran, white owned. They often do conferences in really unsafe spaces or places that have sundown towns because it's quote unquote cheaper. But as we know, they're cheaper for a reason, and they're also unsafe for other members of MANA to go to these conferences. And then there's MEek. MEek is a Midwifery Education Accreditation Council. Its mission is to promote excellence in midwifery education through accreditation. So MEek was developed maybe not too long ago after NAM and MANA. Often the same amount, not same amount, but the same peer group or the same cultural relevance of NAM and MANA, who also is a part of MEek. MEek holds the accreditation of these universities. And I say universities with quotes because you can't transfer a lot of the credits or any of the credits from MEek schools to a regular university, whether it be in the US or in another country. You can get an associate's in midwifery or a bachelor's in midwifery at MEek, but I can't use that bachelor's in midwifery if I wanted to go to Canada, or if I wanted to go to the UK, or if I wanted to go to West Africa, because they just don't align, they don't accredit. It just kind of feels like a useless organization or a way to create barriers of finances and opening schools in that aspect. So a lot of the MEek universities cost almost the same price as a regular university, $20,000, $30,000, sometimes even more, depending on if you're doing a master's or a PhD program. And what makes it difficult is a lot of these programs do not come with federal student loans or grants. And so you're either paying out of pocket or you're taking on a shitload of debt for a degree that won't go anywhere else unless you stay exactly where you are in the same profession for the rest of your life. Then there's a national association. I forgot to mention. So MEek has one Black non-midwife board member. So she's not a midwife. I think she's just a physician and she's on the board, but the rest of MEek's board is white women or white presenting women. Then there is a National Association for Certified Professional Midwives, NACPM. So NACPM is a professional organization of CPMs to support education practice and advancement of CPMs and inspire and engage them to be an organized force for change to increase access to high quality, high value maternity care for all women. And as you can see, a lot of these organizations sound like they all do the same things. So NACPM has the most diverse board with still outnumbered by white women, but almost, equal with Black midwives. I'm not particularly sure exactly what NACPM does. I know they have, or at least within the last year or two, they've been very popular on Instagram and having discussions and talks. They do support quote unquote social justice and gender binary languages and so forth. But in terms of supporting CPMs on a national level, I don't really know what that looks like with NACPM. Then there's the National Association to Advance Black Birth, which used to be ICTC, which was International Childbearing of Traditional of Childbearing. I'm forgetting, if you remember exactly what ICT stands for, put it in the chat for me. And they work to create the number of Black midwives, doulas, healers, empower families in order to reduce infant and maternal mortality. I was at a MANA conference when the National Association to Advance Black Birth switched over from ICTC, so that was about 2018. And I think their mission was to continue ICTC in the same spirit of Shafia Monroe, but without Shafia, it just kind of feels empty. The ICTC conferences were a beautiful space to connect with people, with other Black birth workers or brown birth workers, or just in birth workers in general throughout the country. And it was consistent with making sure that people were up to date in their skills and new information and so forth like that. And so really sad that I never got to participate in ICTC conferences or the community. It sort of ended right as I got into this work. I do know from looking at their website, their entire board is Black. I'm not sure exactly what the deliverables are. They mostly have consulting to talk about maternal mortality or policy. And they also give they give brief or small scholarships, about $500 to $1,000 to Black midwives. So then next is the National Black Midwives Alliance, as a representative voice at the national level that clearly outlines the various needs of Black midwives. So the National Black Midwives Alliance is also connected to the Southern Birth Justice Collective based out of Miami, I think, or somewhere in Florida, with Jamar Amani. And I know I've worked with them a few times, and I know they've mostly been present, I would say, the last 2.5 years, maybe right before pandemic, 2019, maybe around that time. And they were doing a lot of workshops online. They also prepared, what do you call it? PPV for folks when we got into the pandemic, and there was this shortage on getting masks to folks. And what was not also in the media was that midwives have even more of a shortage because no one cares about midwifery in this country. So we had the National Black Midwives Alliance organized to get PPE to everybody. And I know they're also involved in policy level with the omnibus bill. Any questions about these organizations before I go forward? No? Okay. So what happens in midwifery education? I chuckle because the purpose is, to become a midwife, to acquire the skills that you need and to develop a professional career. But what really also happens is a number of things. And so through my own experience, as well as I did a series on interviewing student midwives a couple years ago. You can find their interviews on doulachronicles.com in the blog section, as well as on Instagram and hearing about other students' reviews. And so these are the things that I've collected. And I'm sure there's way more than is not listed on here. And so lack of effective state and national policy support. So as we can see with the last slide, NARM, MANA, and MEEK. Well, all of these organizations are supposed to affect national policies. But I think along with my organizing that was happening in New York City or in New York State with trying to get CPMs legal there, what really became apparent was these three, NARM, MEEK, and MANA. There's just like a lack of energy, support, whatever it will be to try to get midwives licensed, to try to get midwives to go, students to get through school, to support to go to school, get elected officials to understand who we are, have the public and the community understand who we are. There's nothing there. And so when things like a pandemic happens or the national racial uprisings that are happening, they don't really know how to fit in, or they don't fit in at all, or how to support us, because there's never been a process for effective state and national support through policy. I can attest to almost all of these being true in the C&M program too. Yeah, so a lot of this is also from the nursing programs. I would go to the New York midwives meetings, I would say 2019, and it was the majority of nursing students and nursing midwives. And they talked a lot about the same things that I did. And I remember at the time thinking that, oh, well, I'm going to do the CPM route so I can escape abuse. What a wake-up call, right? And so there's also abuse from your preceptors. And so mentioning preceptors, if you're a CPM, you have to be accredited through NARM to become not accredited, but you have to be approved by NARM, the North American Registry of Midwives. Give me 1 second. Apologies. And so NARM is supposed to preview who is going to be a preceptor and allow them to control or be able to teach their students. So majority of what is supposed to happen is that you go through NARM, you say, I am a midwife, whether I'm a nurse midwife, a certified professional midwife, an LM, or a CPM. I am licensed in my state and I am wanting to take on students. And so through that process, you work with a student, whether the student is teaching themselves or taking some online classes or through a school. The preceptor handles the clinical portion of teaching them. And the preceptor also has to sign off on all of their paperwork and signature so they can say that, hey, you did this many hours, you did this many skills, I witnessed you and I taught you and I agree. And so the abuse aspect comes in, as you can see, that the preceptor holds all the power and there is no accountability when the preceptor doesn't agree to teach you what you need to be taught or what you're asking to be taught, where they, where they can withhold signatures. And so say you did a task, they witness you do a task, and then they decide, I don't want to sign off on that. And so you either don't get that skill or you have to go elsewhere. And it's just also from the preceptor standpoint, there's no support from NARM for preceptors. There's no income for it. It's just kind of like this nice gesture that you can do, whether it's a horrible person or not. Sexual assault. I was listening to Dr. Midwife's reports on birthwives closing down, and there were a couple of students who talked about sexual assault when they were doing public exams in their school. And it reminded me that sexual assault also happened at my program when I was at Maternindad La Luz in 2018, before they lost their accreditation. And so the way it's presented is you do a public exam on each other, on your cohort, all the students are with you, whether you want to or not. If you don't do the public exam, they say you don't have to do it, but you're not going to get to learn and blah, blah, blah. Like there's this pressure that this is the only way that you will learn how to do a pap smear. This is the only way that you will learn to look at a cervix. This is the only way if you do it on each other. And I think at the time it was maybe a month or two into my program when we did those exams. And so it was very difficult. I mean, you're doing exams on people who you don't know, who you don't trust, who don't like you, particularly in my case, being the only Black person there, being the only radical person to call out any harm, and to have these same people go and stick a speculum inside you for your preceptor to sign off on. So then you can now say, I can do pap smears on the rest of whoever comes in my capacity. There is a midwife, I can't remember her exact name, but her social media name is Feminist Midwife. And she talks a lot about respectful pelvic care. If you want to learn more about how not to repeat what happened at Birthwise, MLL, or every other school or program that doesn't provide any other resources for you to learn how to do public exams. There's also a lot of trans-exclusionary reproductive feminism, and then there's queerphobia happening. A lot of in these organizations like NARM and meek, and especially schools, not wanting to use gender inclusive language, not wanting to make spaces for queer folks, just feeling very, how do I say this nicely? Feeling very assured that they can do midwifery the way they've always been doing midwifery, regardless of how the times have changed. And so we experience a lot of that harm and violence while we're also students. And there's training programs in schools closing without accountability, like I mentioned, Birthwives closing and Maternindad La Luz closing. And these schools closed because they have been called out for a lot of the racism that they've been continuing for the last 30 years or 40 years, some of them as long as these organizations started, these schools have opened up. And they've kind of gotten to the point to where they can no longer function with violence because of social media, because of we do have a larger support for call out culture now. And so instead of fixing the issues or stepping down and allowing other people to take over, what happens is that these schools just close down. And NARM or MANA or MEEK doesn't provide any resources or any support for what's happening to the students. It just becomes another program in school that is no longer available to everybody, even though there is a small amount of school and preceptors to be at. Then there's national trainings and happening or ignoring pandemic public health recommendations that are also providing with CEUs. So, so CEUs are continuing educational credits that are given by, I feel like it's MEEK, or maybe it's MANA. Some organization approves what can be a CEU accredited class. And so as I've been noticing over this pandemic, it's been, especially as a PEP student, it's more difficult to get trainings that you're not getting in your clinical. So for instance, like a breech or twins or hemorrhaging and IVs and so forth. And so they have these trainings called emergency training skills. And there is a midwife who is very popular going on tour throughout the country with these trainings, and they're completely maskless. They're completely of any COVID protocols and unsafe to kind of be in. I mean, I get that people are anti-vax or anti-mask for whatever reason, but as a healthcare provider, holding a space and having a CEU accreditation for your class, I think it's immoral. I think it's very unethical to have that power and to use it that way. And so, again, there's no accountability when things like that happen. Then there's barriers for Black and Brown schools to open. Within the last year, we've had one school, Black owned by Jenny Joseph, the Common Sense Childbirth Midwifery School. And if you follow through with JJ Way or Jenny Joseph, or even speak with her personally, you know that her opening this school has been a long, long time coming. And the biggest grievance of opening that school, of the struggles that they gave her, was the MEEK organization really made it difficult for that school to open. And it also creates a fear or a barrier for others to follow in Jenny Joseph's footsteps. So that also means less safe spaces for us to go to school, as well as because of the lack of effective state and national policies, a lot of the schools that are open, and so for instance, Jenny Joseph School is open in Florida. You have to live in the state of Florida to go to that school, even if they have a virtual program. And so while I would love to support the school, I don't live in Florida, I can't move to Florida. And so I don't have access to the only Black school, only Black midwifery owned school. Then there's hierarchies.
Would you have to practice in Florida also if you did Jenny Joseph School? Like, I'm not sure of the state licensure level. Like, would it be a license that's only valid in Florida?
So you become a certified professional midwife, and in order to transfer over your LM to another state, you have to already be licensed in that state. So you would have to apply to be licensed in Florida. And then if you wanted to move to another state, you would have to say, I am licensed in Florida, I want to be licensed in California or whatever. And that's how that license transfers over.
So you really kind of have to live in Florida and are going to stay in Florida. Like
for that moment, yes, you do have to be a resident. Yeah. So the hierarchy without deliverables, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of these organizations and boards, they create their own boards. They make their friends, their family members, and they are not accountable to anybody. So if you wanted to complain to Norm about Norm, it's a dead end. There's nothing you can do about it. There's unsustainable student expectations. And so as a student, you are expected to be just without anything. You're expected to be without family. You're expected to be without work. You're expected to be available at all times as the regular midwife. So the midwife, often who works in a group practice, who has a salary, who has a home, who is local to where she's working, you are having to mimic her lifestyle without the resources that midwife has. And so it looks a lot like just living in poverty for 3 to 4 years and struggling with either your mental health because of burnt out and the capacity levels. So for instance, if you're in a group practice and you're the only student, the midwife would probably go to every other birth or every other third birth, or maybe she'll go to birth and the next day clinic will be by another midwife. You as a student have to show up to each of those shifts and each of those births in order to make sure you get the full capacity of learning, but you are not allowed to have that rest. You're not allowed to have that income. You're not allowed to have that support of what that looks like. I remember I was in an apprenticeship earlier this year where the midwife would have like a massage therapist come to the clinic, or she would get her eyelashes done, and she would have all these other resources. And I was just stuck in a studio Airbnb after births and after shifts. And I just felt like this is horrible. And, you know, when I would express to her about the stressors that my body was then feeling and what I was doing to take care of it, the message that I received was, maybe you're just not up for this type of career, or maybe you basically, if you can't take it, then get out the kitchen, right? And that's just kind of how it is in a lot of these midwifery spaces, is that you can't handle the stress of what they're showing you, even with the lack of resources, then you shouldn't be a midwife. So there's very little support for what that looks like. There's no structure for placement support. So placement is if you are in a school and you want to place for your clinicals with a certain practice or a certain hospital and so forth. I know in New York and a lot of the schools have, depending on what schools you have, there's this hierarchy of, well, this school has a relationship with Columbia Hospital or something like that, and so only their students go there. And if you're in a school with less funding and less money, or whatever that case may be, then you having to find placement on your own. And if you do not like your preceptors, it's kind of like an SOL situation, because there's just not enough support there. For instance, as a PEP student, I'm having to find my own placements throughout the years and find midwives that I'm comfortable with. So it requires money to move around and to kind of search for where I'm going, or using social media through that aspect. There's no transparency on financials. So a lot of these organizations take membership funds, take fees for our paperwork, fees for our licensure and so forth. And the fees can go up, and you don't really know why or what's happening, or nothing's changing. So like the fees for NARM, the fees I believe are ridiculously expensive for something that is paperwork that I'm mailing to a PO box, into a group of 5 to 10 people who decide on what your paperwork and your licensure looks like. And also refusal to pick up phones, answer emails on time. or to even listen to grievance and discuss better policies and ways to move about, but you still have to pay that money to them regardless. And then there's trainings, programs, and schools closing out, accountability. So like I mentioned about earlier about Birthwives and MLL closing down, and schools and programs were closed down before then after abuse was noticed to the public and no one really doing anything about it. That was an earful, huh? Let me look at the chat. So yeah, Stephanie Tillman is feminist midwife, and she does a lot of talks and trainings around respective pelvic floor exams. Thank you for sharing that info. I didn't know about these state limitations. Yeah. And so there's just a refusal to grow and liberate with new generations. I forgot to also mention how, so NARM, the North American Registry of Midwives, is supposed to be for North America, right? There's 23 countries in North America. Guess how many countries are included in the North American Registry of Midwives, or that you can use this paperwork for, go to school for, blah, blah, blah. I'll let you guys answer in the chat box. Just think of a group of white women deciding to call it North American and not actually include anybody who's not white. And there you have it. 2, yay, Canada and America. And I think before at one point you were allowed to do international trainings, but because white women going white women, they were going to undeveloped countries deep in poverty, and exploiting the countries and using the people to get their quote unquote numbers and leaving them with nothing in the end. And so they decided the way to fix international medical tourism was just to cancel the pathway at all. Totally forget about those of us who are actually from these countries. And yeah. So the refusal to grow and liberate with the new generation is a large gap that we are missing when we're talking about maternal mortality. What is happening from the provider standpoint, or from the public standpoint, is that there's racism in the medical industrial complex, which is true. But then there's also who develops the medical industrial complex, who works in the medical industrial complex, who employs the medical industrial complex, who teaches the medical industrial complex. And that's where we're having to really get to the foundation of what this looks like. And if our foundation is these organizations that are inherently white supremacist and violent, creating these barriers and issues for students to graduate, and then also creating harmful students, and then we become midwives. And if midwives are promoted in the media as it's this better place or a better position to go to for a better outcome in birth, when in really we're just we have less resources to fuck you up. That's basically what is happening. It's not necessarily they're better people or we're better trained in that aspect. We have to also all really remove ourselves from these institutions to unlearn what was taught once we have our licenses, to relearn better and to how to exist in community from there. There's, along with a lot of the board members, there is a huge age gap with who is controlling midwifery and who decides on gets to be a midwife versus who is a student. Students' ages usually range from places in the 20s and 30s, maybe early 40s. And a lot of these board members are over 60s, 70s, some are in 80s, who have been working for a very long time, refusing to give up power, refusing to just evolve. All right, so strategy steps. There's always room for noting, there's always room for noting when things aren't okay, right? But there's also, what do we do from there? And so these are strategy steps that I would like to see, and I definitely would love for people to communicate more on what that looks like for everyone. So locally, we start with connecting with other birth workers in the community. Often folks are looking outwardly for someone to organize them. We're always often looking for a leader to organize them ourselves. But as we've seen in the past, you know, when there is a leader and that leader is empowered, there's sometimes a unstructuring of power, or if that leader is killed or removed, then there's a fall of that organization and that program, right? And so collectively, we need to lead ourselves. And so I suggest connecting with birth workers in your community if you have not already done that. Having consistent meetups. And so whether that looks like having an email thread or a WhatsApp chat or getting on Zoom or having a phone call or safe ways to meet in person. Making sure that it's consistent so that it is growing with each other and create goals together. On a state level, creating a cooperative or a collective. I feel that a co-op or a collective is a lot more sustainable and easier to hold each other accountable than a nonprofit or an organization with board members. The state group or cooperative or collective should also meet with elected officials. Unfortunately, we are still having to exist in the system in some ways, and that does look like getting policy and laws and bills passed. And doing that is a lot easier when you're meeting with your elected officials. Strategize awareness campaigns. So really connecting with the public. So radio interviews, media, hashtag, commercials, barbershops, nail salons, grocery stores, clinics. Go where the people are going. On a national level, using these cooperatives or collectives to join forces with other state cooperatives and collectives. And so, for instance, like if we're doing a national co-op or a state co-op in New York, us connecting with what's happening in Jersey or what's connected in Philadelphia, midwives, or maybe even Georgia and California. And so after national, we are able to then connect globally. So having all of our collectives meet together as a one force to really connect with the global South, all regions of Africa and Asia and the Caribbean, and really going from there. Any questions or thoughts, comments, concerns? Feel free to turn on your mic and let me know. I'm gonna stop the recording as well.